Hello, welcome to another business and software conference Hangout. I'm Mark Littlewood and delighted to welcome at the other end of this screen today, Michael Skok.
Hi Mark, how are you doing?
Really good. Where are you, Michael?
Sunny Boston, and I'm happy to say it is sunny after the winter we've had. We need it.
Everyone I speak to in Boston just bitches about the weather, but it stopped this week, so maybe summer is coming and all the rest of it. I hope it.
Took the mothers. It took the mothers to get the weather out. Mother's Day was beautiful, and ever since then we've all been smiling.
Well, that's just another thing to thank mothers for, right?
Exactly.
So you talked last year at Business Software Conference. One of the only VCs we've ever had talk.
Maybe the last, by the sounds of things.
No, well, you need to update us on what you're doing, right? So it's really, fascinating to get a sense of value and value creation in business. And your talk was about building a billion-dollar company. We're going to talk today a little bit about some of the things that you were describing and going over in that talk. But can you just give us a little bit of background, first of all, on you and what you had been doing at that point, and then get us up to date, because things have changed a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to do so. So for most people who know me, they probably knew me in the first 21 years of my career as an entrepreneur. And that was fun because it was a lot of learning. And then when I stepped into the VC world, I had no idea how long that was going to take to kind of understand, and it turned out to be a 12-year journey. And I've continued it, but I've changed to being an independent investor. So since you last saw me, stepped out to investing directly, which has been a pleasure. And the themes still are the same, big opportunities in things like cloud, disruptive business models with things like open source, and in between, of course, thematic things that I'm really quite excited about, like e-commerce, where there's obviously just so much still to be done. So that's the sort of, if you like, day-to-day life. And then I'm happy to be continuing my teaching work at Harvard, and got actually more involved, not less involved with Harvard over the last few months, and worked with the business school to, for example, go on their investment committee for their new ventures at the Rock Center, which has been a lot of fun. So just investing and teaching, to simplify and summarize.
Fantastic. And what's the main difference between investing on your own account and investing in a fund?
Speed. One of the things that's so important to entrepreneurs is to be able to get right to the decision maker and figure out, how are they going to build their business? What is it that they need? How can they get the resources, whether it's people or capital, etc. And I'm looking to put together a very entrepreneur-centric way of doing this. But I've always sort of thought about the entrepreneur as my customer. It's easy to say that, but in practice, anything that you put between you and the entrepreneur is a barrier to that. So by being independent, I can rally the resources that I want, but be directly connected to the entrepreneur in the way that I think is the personal touch that they want. Right.
So how would you describe yourself when you're wandering around Boston's dens of networking?
Well, that's it.
Are you an angel, or are you a sort of an independent?
The deals I'm doing will be full life cycle, so everything from early stage to public companies. And in fact, most people probably don't know this, but I run a public company fund and portfolio, and have done for 26 years or so. But it's not something that I ask for money for other people from. So it's just something I run for myself. It's actually a great way of staying true to, if you like, really proving that these companies build value for the long term. It's a fun stat for you, actually. I'll share it. So hopefully everybody in the audience can have a bit of fun with this. If you look at the great software companies and SaaS, you just take the whole SaaS universe, you'll find that there's about 3 to 5x more money to be made in the 5 to 7 years after they go public. And so those of you who are interested in becoming investors and following the good companies, I think have a potential to enjoy that spectrum of the investment cycle too.
Very interesting. Well, we'll maybe come back to that, because I think there's a whole ton of things around investing that we could pick your brains on. But just tell us a little bit about 0 to a billion and what the talk was about.
Well, I think one of the things that I'm always interested in is understanding entrepreneurs' perspective when they start a venture, and I think about it as a vector. So if you start out with a vector that says, your aim is to become a $10 million lifestyle business, you're obviously going to build it very differently than if you say, no, my vector is that I want to build a $1 billion revenue company over some period of time. And so what we were doing in the talk, which I think was fun, was we were taking a step back and looking at an example of a company that did start that way. That was Demandware at the time. And if you remember, we brought in the CFO who had worked with me during that venture, which was Skok, and he shared the metric side of it. What I spent most of the time trying to do was talk about how do we get what I call an RSVP model going: repeatable, scalable, valuable, and predictable. Because those 4 elements are actually the things that you have to spend time on if you're really going to go after something very big.
And the RSVP model, I think, is clever. Can you give us a little bit of a little bit more detail about it, because it does give us a good sense. And I'd like to sort of understand how that applies as you start to grow a business as well, because clearly there's that the lean startup bit's been quite well explored, but how does that scale?
Yeah, the scale piece is the really fun part. So the first word, repeatable, is the one that everybody thinks is easy, because they think, okay, we build a minimum viable product and we get our first set of customers, and every customer is going to be the same, and of course that's where it all falls apart. So the repeatable word is the first one to just dig into for a second. And I have a particular way of challenging entrepreneurs that I call the MVS. So just alongside the MVP is this notion of an MVS that is the minimum viable segment. So if we think about this, let me actually use a whiteboard just for have some fun.
Cool.
I'm in a room and I can do that. You tell me if you can't see me, I'll step up. So everybody starts with our MVP. And I'm putting it as a small dot here intentionally because it's supposed to be small. But they're trying to address this huge marketplace here. Hopefully huge. Obviously, if we're going after a big business, the bigger the better. And the first problem is, okay, if you've got a customer over here, and you get a customer over here, and a customer over here, and you get a customer over here, where do you try to get repeatability? You try to do it by going from here to here, to here, to here. My experience is when you do that, your business starts to run into not a minimum viable product, but a maximum coverage product, which is really not what you want at all. Your product gets...
I've seen company logos that look worse than that, actually, Michael, by the way.
But the joy of this is it is graphic. You start with a small product and you try to meet too many customers' needs and it bloats. It just gets really big. So the point is that instead of doing that, I'll just grab another color. What we try to do is we say, how do you get repeatability with a set of customers? And they may not all be in a vertical, but they may all have the same need. And in fact, that's what you're really looking for, where this MVP doesn't have to change. It can stay at that same footprint because it's meeting the same set of needs for the same set of customers. And they may be, for example, if we typically hear about this, people will say things like, oh, it's a vertical, or it's financial services, or it's pharma. But what if we said, no, the need is actually compliance? And then we go down one level and we say, actually, compliance for who? Is it, for example, for the CFO, or is it for somebody in security? But getting to the same personas and the same needs gives you the ability to get the same solution repeating. So this is what I call an MVS. Very ugly drawing of it here, but there's a much better description of it on our website. But as an example, when we say repeatability, it's an easy word. What we're really trying to do is help the startup find that same set of needs with the same set of personas that they can just consistently get repetition of the use of their product, and that gives them the traction. So that's just a starting point, if that helps you.
Very interesting. So where do people go wrong in there with this?
Well, let's take the second letter. Great question that you asked. You're like a straight man. It's perfect.
Right.
So where people go wrong is a very easy thing to say and a very hard thing to do. Of course, we all talk about product market fit. So what I was just describing was sort of the early repeatability to try to figure out whether you've got a product that fits a set of customer needs. The next challenge is, how do you get to that scalability, the S in the RSVP? And scalability comes when you can see resources being applied and consistent results coming on the other side of it. In other words, you put $1 in, you get 10 back. And if you keep seeing that repeatedly, it's easy to scale. And I wish that was as easy for startups as I just described. The reality is where things go wrong, to answer your question, is usually entrepreneurs get signals early on that tell them that, oh, they've got product market fit. It looks like, the first 5 customers have bought and they're going to buy, very repeatedly from here on in. Yeah. Well, that may be true. But I'll now introduce another thought, and we talked a little bit about this at the event, which is that customers don't buy everything all up front. I mean, when have you ever heard of, for example, BP buying every license they possibly need up front from you as a startup? They just don't. They initially, try to find you, then they trial it, and then they buy some and they explore whether it's good, and they probably have a limited use case for it. And then they obviously deploy it, and if it's starting to do well, they hopefully expand their use of it. Yeah. So to put that in context, what happens is most startups, start to read the signals from trials and think that they're getting adoption. And the really important thing to do is to say, wait a second, I'm still getting at trials. What's actually getting adoption? What is really being used at my customer? Is it really getting deployed broadly? And if so, is that overall, see, try, buy, fly, as I call it, model, starting to work for you in a way that you can actually scale it? And that's the piece that just takes time, to be honest with you. Most startups go wrong because they read the signals too early. They think they've got lots of customers, but actually those customers aren't really deeply using the product or aren't really deeply deploying it. So it's a signaling issue and it's a metrics issue. You've got to read the signals right, and you've got to define your metrics carefully. So you really start to understand that you're seeing this potential for scale.
It's fascinating. So one of the things I do as a very part-time side thing is work with a VC fund here that invests in some reasonably early stage companies. I mean, it does some seed, 250,000 level, and then typically it's kind of investing 1 to 3 or 4 million in a business over its lifetime. So it's not sort of massive, but it's not a sort of an angel thing. The type of companies that they have coming through, if you look at their pipelines, quite often will very proudly have their top 10 companies are probably going to fit into maybe 4 or 5 different segments. And they would all sort of see that as evidence that it's going to get traction in lots of places. How can you encourage people to focus? I guess I ask that as a potential investor, but I mean, I see this happening all the time. I see it sort of coming in on both sides. It's really obvious when it happens, but how do you sort of get the company to focus on the right thing? Is that an understanding why it's an important thing, or is discovery an important part of the process and I'm missing something?
No, I mean, so let me make sure I've characterized this right too. I think you're asking, how do you help a company find its initial starting point, get focused on it, and then build on success, rather than what I say you never want to do, which is cut back on failure. And the best word in between those two statements is focus. In other words, if you focus and figure out where you're successful in a small way to start off with, then you can always build on it. But if you go after boiling the ocean, then you're going to end up by default cutting back on failure, because it's never possible as a startup to do that. And so, I mean, it's common sense, but let's just go over it for a second. I often hear startups say, we've got a big vision. And I think that's awesome. Big visions are important.
Conservative projections, presumably.
Right, exactly. But big visions are important. Like, if you want to do something meaningful and impactful, and here we are talking about building billion-dollar companies, well, obviously that requires a big vision and a bold bet. But the difference between vision and execution is breaking this down into a focused series of steps that you can actually work through as a roadmap. And so the first thing I'd say to entrepreneurs is, I see this all the time. There's a confusion between where you start with your execution and what you want to become over the many years in terms of going after your vision. And so, step one is be willing to really clearly spell out a roadmap between the reality of, the two guys in a garage or two gals in a garage who are starting out with a limited amount of resources and what you can and can't do with those resources. And by the way, it might be a tiny, tiny, tiny product going after, the handful of customers in your backyard. But if you win those customers and you're successful getting them to actually repeatedly buy your software and, upgrade and work with it or whatever it is that you're selling, your service, then obviously you can build on that success. But by contrast, if you go after the big vision and you announce to the world that we are going to be the next great SaaS company that is going to take over Oracle, just to say you're going to have a lot of enemies and very few people will understand what on earth they should do to start with you. And there's nothing digestible in that statement. It's, it's like, okay, now what do I engage with?
Yes, but
what's that?
It worked for Benioff for a bit, didn't it?
Well, it worked for Benioff, by the way, because he was at a time, I think, very smart about stating something bold, which was the sort of no software claim. And so that got people paying attention to it. But if you went back and you looked at the original CRM product that they produced, it was horribly under-featured and under-functional. I mean, it was really...
They changed that quickly enough.
Yeah, and there's your keys. They moved fast.
Fascinating. Okay, so so sort of repeatable and scalable. I'm still. How do you know if when you're in a company when is the time to really kind of focus on that thing? Because there is this discovery process. You come up, you've got the thing. You probably are going to go after multiple markets to kind of see what bites. But can you kind of maintain that, or how long can you maintain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a tension point here. Obviously, you need to be free to experiment when you're a startup to try to understand, what is the opportunity that you can connect with. But I'd say there's one critical thing there, and we talked a little bit about it at the conference too, which is be careful to distinguish between ideas and problems. So, ideas, we all have lots of them, and they are to a penny, as we all know. The problems that we are seeking are the key. In other words, what customer problems can we identify early on that we can get traction with? And so I definitely encourage, trying to figure out when you're experimenting with customers around the different problems they have, and then to prioritize which ones of their problems are really painful enough that they make it into the top 1, 2, or 3, so that they're going to pay attention to you by default because their pain is great enough that it's prioritized over everything else. And again, that's very different to going out and just saying, hey, I've got an idea, let me just try this idea with somebody. So it's a discipline really of defining the pain and need in a marketplace in a way that you can see a problem that you can address very conspicuously. And until you've kind of experimented enough and found pain and need where somebody says, I'm willing to write you a check, you haven't got a market. And so I'm particularly in the B2B world, this is really true. We all talk about going out and doing research. Research is meaningless until somebody writes you a check. The only research that matters is ultimately a paying customer.
Or pilot customers that don't pay.
Well, pilot customers are really, it's an interesting thing. Lots of people debate this, right? Pilot customers on their way to paying are fine by me. Yeah. So in other words, I have no problem you going to a customer and saying, hey, British Telecom, we've decided we want to work with you on this problem you've identified. But obviously, in order to earn your trust, we're willing to do this proof of concept. And actually, I like proof of value. One of my great guys actually in the company I'm sitting in at Acquia, Brian Haas, came up with this concept of proof of value, never mind proof of concept. So they do proof of values, and they're quite willing to do that. But the other side of it is you've got to get an agreement out of BT at that point to say, once we've proven this value, you're going to let us go after and pay for this project. And I'm so clear with entrepreneurs about this. It's so important to get that part of the initial proof of value. Sign off those two things simultaneously. In other words, we've earned the right, once we do this proof of value, to do this project, and get them to sign on that up front, as opposed to leave it in vague terms and say, yeah, we'll come in and do a demo for you or let you trial it, and you can have it for 30 days, whatever. That can work, but in large enterprise stuff, generally not a good way.
Mm. And you don't do much with consumer, do you?
Personally, I don't, but I have huge respect for it. And some of the guys that I'm working with in my syndicate at the moment are very good consumer. And the reason I have respect for it is I think we're all undergoing the consumerization of the enterprise. And so I think this notion of free trials and self-service downloads and everything else, I do believe can work and indeed is becoming more and more the expectation in the enterprise. But at some point, that has to turn into somebody saying, okay, how do I actually apply this on something that I'm going to pay for? And so that phase of, if you like, I call it addiction before adoption, of getting people addicted to your product before they start adopting it. Sure, use all the consumer techniques in the world. Make it self-service, really easy to try and do all that stuff. But if when you want adoption, some of the things we just started talking about are really important.
Interesting. So, I mean, and I think there is a lot of kind of flow between the two types of organisation at the moment. There were a few kind of SaaS companies that started out with a fairly kind of consumer-focused model. I mean, they were clearly B2B businesses. They were offering enterprise collaboration for the sake of mutual. I mean, Ali McLaughlin, don't you? So, I mean, I guess the kind of concept with Huddle originally was getting a lot of users within enterprises who were paying for it off their own credit cards, and then actually you get to a sort of critical mass. And that really didn't, I mean, I don't know whether it didn't work specifically for Huddle for a reason, but that model hasn't really worked for many organizations, has it?
No, I mean, it's well, let's put it this way. It's a difficult model because what you're really looking for there is a grassroots adoption by consumers, individuals, that then, of course, draw you into the enterprise. So where it has worked, of course, is Dropbox. And they've had to figure out how they could compete with Box, who were much more focused on the enterprise. But if you talk to Drew, he's been absolutely relentlessly focused on the consumer experience to make sure that there was a why wouldn't you approach to using Dropbox, which caused people to walk into the enterprise, and Evernote would fall into the same category, and there's a bunch of others that made the enterprise ultimately a bunch of individuals who were already using this pay attention to, okay, well, now we've got all these people using it. How do we make sure it's secure and compliant and backed up, or it's managed, etc. So I think that you have to have a long-term view on it. I mean, I mentioned I'm an investor in disruptive business models. I mean, consumerization of enterprise is a disruptive business model. Open source is another one. The big thing about it, and I think this is the key for entrepreneurs to make sure that they don't get lost on, is timing. You have to have a significant amount of patience for those grassroots-based models to work. You have to be willing to take the time to really let the penetration, the seeding, if you will, of the individual users or consumers play out, and then, of course, get flooding into the enterprise, and then ultimately, move from the grassroots up the organization. And if you're willing to do that, and if you're consistent about your pursuit of that as a model, it makes tons of sense. I think the risk is that people, your investors aren't patient enough, or you expect results too quickly, or you get out of sync and you start to try to charge before you're really ready. Or you basically, as I use these phases, I have 4 A's that I'll just tell you: addiction, adoption, absorption, and then adaptation. And I have a white paper coming out on this soon. So in the addiction phase that we were talking about, it's incredibly important that people have decided that they love your product, they love your service, before you try to get them to buy it. Because if they don't see value, they're not going to pay for it. So that's the addiction piece before adoption. The adoption phase is super important because, as we were talking about earlier, selling somebody something does not mean to say they're using it. And I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret that I'm going to reveal in the white paper. We used to talk about shelfware in the old B2B era, and I'm dating myself here, but 20, 30 years ago, shelfware was a big problem. People would sell consumer products and they would sit on the shelf, and they would congratulate themselves for having sold 10,000 copies of whatever it was. loaders 1, 2, 3. And then they'd find out that, only 100 people were using it. So shelfware, we all thought had gone away. And it turns out it hasn't, because companies that are trying to get big licenses in the SaaS world are just as potentially guilty of doing the same thing. And so even though the licensing is, use it and pay for it as you go, the reality is that if you sell it too quickly before it's really getting adopted, you're going to have that same shelfware problem. And so I'm seeing this. I've actually, done, as you know, I run a survey every year to try to see who the broad sort of, from the broad players, what's going on. And I've seen that there hasn't been enough appreciation of it still takes time for SaaS software to get adopted. It might be easier to use, it might have no installs, but the fact is it's still being adopted into business processes. And so until large companies in particular figure out how to absorb you, and that's the next piece, into their business process, you're not going to get really broad adoption. So the third A, just to carry on this thought of absorption, is you're looking for particular projects where you can get as full an absorption into the company as possible. So we'll just use some numbers. Let's say you have a company that has potentially 1,000 seats of your SaaS software. You start off with a trial of 10, for the few critical users who want to prove it. They get addicted to it. They adopt it for a project, and 100 users in, for example, accounting now use it. And so they're very happy with it. That is an absorption rate of 10%. You're 100 users out of the potential 1,000 in the company. How do you get the other 90%? That's the absorption part. And typically, it happens when somebody moves from either using this in accounting to now using it in sales or in marketing, or of course in other areas, whatever it might be. So it might be departmental use, or it might be geographic use, etc. But pay attention to what are the factors that move your absorption from 10% to 100%, or if not 100%, close to it. And then the last A is an easy one, but an incredibly important one. It gets to the RSVP model again to sort of close the loop, and that's adaptation. So let's say you've now got all 1,000 users using your product. How are you going to continue to make money out of them? Obviously, you're going to make money every year from renewals if they're very happy. That's very, very key. But what you really want is upsell. You want to find out what's their next need. What are the things that, as you adapt to their business or they adopt you in their business, what are the things they need as new functionality, new capabilities, etc. And if you can adapt your product to that and upsell them that as incremental value, you get huge value. And to tie it all the way back, in a second, I'll explain to you how those things relate to the value. But those are the 4 A's: addiction, before adoption, before absorption, before adaptation.
Interesting, because the upsell piece was one of the things that you talked about in your talk, if I remember, about, that's one of your kind of key metrics, one of your key value drivers. And I maybe that's a good time to, I know you hate the sound of metrics, KPIs. What do you, because I know a lot of people talk a lot of kind of nonsense about, there's a ton of stuff about vanity metrics. What are the things people need to think about at an early stage and as you scale?
Well,
in your view?
It's terribly easy to reduce things to metrics, which is why I'm always careful not to do so. Because if you're not careful, the metrics become the sort of way in which you run the business, as opposed to paying attention to your customers and really what they're experiencing. But there are 2 metrics that I think in the SaaS world are super, super important. One is retention. Obviously, seeing customers churn is your enemy, and it proves that you're not getting the real adoption that we talked about earlier. And so retention is critical. And then the second one that we just talked about is upsell. And just to put the 2 together, if you looked at the valuation of the top SaaS companies, there's a very high correlation in value between the companies that have high retention rates and high valuations. And there's an even higher multiple that comes out of companies that not only retain their customers, but can then upsell them. And that's why that adaptation phase is so important. If you can adapt to customers' needs, find out what they are, and upsell them new products and services, you get even higher value. And let me explain why. It's incredibly obvious when I say it, which is you already have the customer. So you have no cost of customer acquisition. This incremental sell that you're doing of a new product or a new service in the upsell phase is basically going to drop right to the bottom line. And investors understand that. They know that, you know, they're going to see the benefit fall all the way through the P&L without the traditional cost of sales and service, sales and marketing.
There's been a lot of criticism for SaaS companies that have been focusing on building revenue, and you know, they've obviously got to get over their $100 million revenue to have a go at an IPO.
Yeah.
I mean, Salesforce is sort of widely commented on as it sort of buys customers, and there's always been that sort of, it's always been a bit of a sort of a mystery to people as to why those companies did keep increasing in value as they were essentially buying customers.
Yeah, Box was probably the poster child for this recently.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you looked at their P&L and they were well over 100% of sales and marketing spend as a percentage of revenue, you know, to acquire their customers. And people, of course,
so is the market just valuing the business based on the retention and upsell that they can prove? Or, I mean, is there a relationship there? Or?
There is, yeah. So let's use
really
very simple, let's use very simple math, because it always makes it easier. If it costs you $100 to acquire a customer, and you only keep them for a year, and you can only get $100 out of them, then you're at break even, basically. You make no money out. But if it costs you $500 to acquire a customer, and you can get 5 years of life out of them, and in that 5 years, their usage goes from, say, $100 to $1,000 a year, you're making money. And so the goal is obviously to understand two other elements in this thing that we just introduced here. One is the life cycle for the customer. You know, if you're retaining them forever, then obviously, you know, the life cycle is infinite. But in reality, you know, most products can't even say, you know, more than 3 years, because it's difficult to even predict that.
No.
But there are categories of products that have 5 to 7 year life cycles, and you know, I'm sitting in one right now, so it's easy to say. People like, you know, NBC or you know, Time Warner, or some of the big companies in the world that go off to create their brands or the websites, or you know, their commerce projects, etc. Those actually don't turn over quickly. They typically last for 5 to 7 years. Once people have put in a platform to manage their community, their content, their commerce, they stick with it for years. And so that life cycle is incredibly important. And then the other piece is obviously the average selling price, or the average deal size, or the average revenue per customer, the ARPU per customer over a year. And if that keeps going up and you keep having long life cycles, you can probably afford to buy a customer in the first year or two, knowing that you've got 5 to 7 years to ultimately serve them profitably as they buy more and more from you. So it's really those things that tie it together.
But the accusation against some companies is they're just playing that game. Is that?
Yeah. So that's why I really you're going to enjoy this. I'll preview something for you, since you know it's you, and I trust you to just, you know, I'll share it when it's published. But I've gone back to basics with some entrepreneurs after the last 6 months of listening to them, and I've written an article that is called "The Power of One," and it's basically to remind them that you really win big markets one customer at a time. And so, you know, it's all great to go buy customers, but if customer at a time, you're not making your customers successful, and you're not seeing what we just talked about, which is true, you know, adoption and absorption, and ultimately adaptation to upsell them, you're never going to be successful, because you can buy the customers, but they'll just churn, and you won't get the renewals, and you won't get the upsells, and so you won't get the ultimate value from them, and your P&L will show it. So it only works to buy customers if you do all the right things to actually get them growing with you. And I'll tell you bluntly where we go wrong, because, you know, I'm going to give you the nugget of what came out of this 6 months of research, is that we assume that it's all the same people that should do those things. And in reality, it's a massively different set of skills that start, for example, hunting, just to simplify it, versus farming. And I won't bore you with all the rest of the details. The rest of it, you'll find in the paper. But you've got to evolve your organization. You've got to figure out your customer touch points to actually service the customer so they do grow with you. They do get the true, you know, absorption of the product at the rate you want. and for you to end up having these, long life cycles with your customers that are very profitable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that you touched on something, or you mentioned something, you corrected yourself earlier, which was you said company and you said, no, I mean startup, and you were referring, I'm assuming, to discrete units. Where is the difference? Where's the separation for you?
Well, love that question, and I'll be honest with you. I've been proven wrong on this one so many times. I'm going to just fess up to not having an answer. But I try to distinguish between startups and companies as follows. I think that startups are nimble, fast-moving, lean, agile, whatever you want to call it, beings. Companies at some point have a legacy, and so you're a startup in my book as long as you can avoid having a legacy, and that may mean you're billions of dollars big.
Yeah.
And for example, I can't resist sharing one of the stories that attracted me to working with a great entrepreneur, Dries Beitat, the founder of Drupal. It just so happens he's out at DrupalCon this week, talking about Drupal 8. He has consistently broken the architecture of Drupal every release. In other words, he's done his own innovator's dilemma to himself and to Drupal every release. So he's never ended up with a legacy. Now, that's not entirely true, because of course there are customers that are on Drupal 6 or Drupal 7. But the point is, the really great startups, to answer your question in my mind, work really hard not to get stuck in a legacy where they can't be nimble and fast and agile because they're so busy serving their customers, and they have got stuck with, say, an old architecture or an old business model. And that's, by the way, when things go wrong. That's why SAP is struggling with SaaS now, because they're so hooked on their old business model that SaaS is a huge transition for them. So they're a company in my mind, whereas potentially you could even say Salesforce is still maybe a startup. The extreme, if they've managed to keep their legacy. I think they've got a legacy these days, but
it's interesting. I mean, and I think watching companies grow through these different phases. I was talking to one of the guys who's talking at Business Software Conference Europe this year, a guy called Stephen Aller. And he's going to talk about I haven't finalized the conversation yet, but I think it'll be around the 7 phases of companies, and actually it's much more about the number of people in a business. The nature of a business changes when you're a founder. Then you have employees. Up to sort of 7 people you can have direct reports, and then you've got sort of 7 times 7 is 49 and 350, and those are very different stages of growth. And as you get bigger, you have a similar sort of thing. How do you keep your long-term vision as you go through those phases, but actually kind of retool the business?
It's really funny that you say that. I didn't use 7, but I used to have what I call the rule of 6. So exactly the same principle there. The first 6 people, they're all friends. They're usually founders. They have a water cooler. Multiply it by 6, you need a management team the minute you get to 36, because the lines of communication are at that point immediately one step removed from your initial group. And it turns out that the next phase is the one where most startups really struggle, which is when you multiply that to get to a couple of hundred people. And the reason that most startups struggle there is that hiring a management team is one thing, but to get to the next stage, you actually need to build a middle management layer. And it's not even a layer. It's really a system, if you like, for maintaining the communications that keep the company fast-moving and nimble, etc. And middle management's a funny thing. If you went out and tried to hire middle management, you would prove, first of all, 2 things. One is that you didn't hire good managers, because good managers would grow the middle management team. They wouldn't hire them. And they would be promoting from within, and they'd be proving that they can actually grow people, which is super important. But the second thing is that team needs to be the sort of grassroots of the company, because they're going to be the group that is most often making decisions actually closest to the customer. And so it's super important in that phase of growth that you enable and empower and train and coach and develop the up-and-comers and the potential sort of, if you like, long-term leaders. And in the next multiple of 6 is the challenge that you typically see companies go through before they go public. And it is, let's say, somewhere between a couple hundred people and 1,000 people, which is usually when I see my companies go public. And then in that phase, there's another trick that happens, which is, do you actually manage to promote people who are succeeding in their jobs who don't necessarily want to become managers. So for example, engineers, great engineers are very unlikely to ever want to become managers. In fact, you know, and then by the way, you wouldn't want them to become great, managers, because they're fabulous engineers. They're the engineers that get 10x productivity. So now you put them in a management job, you've just lost that. A few of them make that jump, and by the way, they're fabulous when they do. But same is true as
I'm always amazed at how brilliant engineers are at sales, actually.
Fabulous.
To do it.
Well said. I love that. Yeah, cross-functional is huge.
A good friend of mine has a theory that anyone that he employs in a marketing role, he's a tech company guy, anyone he employs in a marketing role should be an engineer from Cambridge. He's based in Cambridge, with a third-class degree. So it'll take a third or a 2-2, because it basically means someone had the smarts to get to study at a difficult university, but they've also probably spent all their time being sociable and playing rugby or rowing or whatever it was. Because everybody kind of enters that kind of cohort at a certain kind of level of thing, and some of them go off and be very introverted and brilliant, and some of them find their wings, and those are the people. And he said he's never regretted it as a strategy, because they can understand the maths and do the data.
Yeah, well, this is another piece of it that you're hinting at, and so let's bring it into focus, which is figuring out what your culture is. Culture is a very woefully underestimated subject in startups, and in truth, of all the things that I just talked about changing in a startup, for example, changing business models, or changing how you go to market, or changing organizational dynamics, the one thing that good startups don't change is their culture. They find a way to build a consistent culture that actually really does stay with the business as it scales. And that's the enabling, if you will, undercurrent that supports their growth. So, it's funny. I describe this as the hardest soft subject that I teach, because it's, you can't just put culture out on a board and say, here, just adopt this. Culture comes from the top. It's what you do, not what you say. It's how you act. It's about, how you in the end, for example, engage your customers, all those other things. But if you can establish that really early on, and you can get very clear and consistent basis for people to, for example, treat each other, treat the customers, and, for example, make decisions and communicate well, that is the basis for companies to scale successfully. And independent size, by the way.
No, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think it's one of those things that we've talked about for years at Boss. There was a guy who was head of HR at SAS. I don't know if you remember, who gave a really fascinating and very data-rich talk, actually, looking at public companies that had changed culture. And you can change culture in a number of kind of obvious ways from the outside. I mean, kind of losing founders is one thing, but there are various other. If you start to define what cultures are, and then you look at how they grow, companies quite often try and change their culture entirely, and that is always a value destructive.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we've got one in focus right now with Carly Fiorina taking center stage as a politician. I don't know how she can do that with a straight face after what she did at HP. I mean, HP used to have the most fabulous culture. There was the HP way, management by wandering around, many things that we've taken for granted that gave birth to many great companies like Apple and Apollo and others, and not Apollo, excuse me, Apple and others in Silicon Valley came out of the HP culture. But Carly came in and tried to change the culture there and destroyed value in not to pick on her specifically, but value just drained out of that company.
Yeah, no, I'm going to share it. Did you see Fiorina.org?
I didn't actually, no.
No, how do I share this?
On the left-hand side, just hit the share button. There's a funky thing.
I don't want to do the share. Do I want to showcase? I'll try that. Questions aren't working for some reason.
Got a big, I think it's the green button with the sort of arrow on it.
Screen share.
Yeah.
I want to share the screen. All it's doing is showing. It's in Thai. I don't think I want to screenshot. Go and look at carlyfiorina.org anyway. It's
okay, well,
a good lesson in getting your pre-campaign URLs. No, fascinating thing. I think she. I don't quite sort of understand how people have that lack of self-awareness, or maybe it's.
Well, we've all got our failings. I've got plenty of.
Cool. So a couple of other questions we did have. One was around investing and a bubble.
Yeah.
And people talk about this stuff. A lot of people say to me, I've been doing something for X number of years, I've got this great business, it's a couple of million, it's profitable, it's employing a bunch of people, and then I hear a bunch of people that have come out with an idea, they haven't got any experience, and they're getting funding for it. It does make me wonder whether I should stop. Are there really fashionable sectors for investors, and what should companies that are doing unfashionable things do about that?
I love this question. There definitely are. I mean, we are, as a race, just unfortunately influenced by the group, and it's just a fact. The guy that's out doing something that nobody really understands off in the corner, ironically, could turn out to be the next Elon Musk. But in the meantime, if everybody thinks they've got the next Facebook or Twitter or social media thing, and they see that you can get the pops of Instagram from a team that's tiny, or Slack that's suddenly discovered the next messaging app, or WhatsApp, whatever, inevitably people will go and build another messaging app, or come up with another search engine or another social network. It's just it's human nature. So it's hard to avoid the fashion. I think the trick is to understand very, very specifically what is it that you are doing that is unique and at least an order of magnitude better to break through what will inevitably be an enormous amount of noise in those sectors. And I'm very respectful here, because I've had my head handed to me many times when you make bold statements like, well, don't just follow the fashion, come up with your own approach. Actually, that could be completely wrong. It turns out that, for example, we'd never have had Google if everybody had said, oh, search is done. Or we'd never have had WhatsApp if everybody said, messaging has been done, so on and so forth. So my point is that it's not necessarily a bad thing to look in existing market spaces, but it is important to really be clear about what are you serving, who are you serving uniquely well with what in at least an order of magnitude improvement. Then I think the second question you were asking is important is, well, what if you're in an area that actually isn't popular and that you're trying to compete for funding against all the noise? Don't give up. I mean, in many instances, that is going to be, of course, harder. And I'm sure if you really read the stories of, I was one of them, but entrepreneurs and founders that have actually worked through that, they work through it because they believe in it. And if they have conviction in it, there is no reason why they're not going to be the next Elon Musk. And, who knows whether SpaceX is a great thing, but he's got conviction and he's, seeing it through. And it takes an enormous amount, obviously, of passion and persistence to do that. So don't go at it half-heartedly, because there is no way to play other than full-on in those kinds of situations. But I'm all for entrepreneurs who have that conviction.
So did you, when you were running a software company, did you raise funds, or did you do it independently?
No, I raised funds, but here's my lesson from that, and I've written an article on it, but I'll just simplify it. I called it the funding mirage. And the mirage is that you think you're doing well because you're raising incredible amounts of money at great valuations, and we are really in danger of that right now. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. The late stage is in a bubble. Period. End of story. It's only a matter of
the bubble.
What's that?
You think late stage is the bubble? Well,
yeah. No, I mean, and the bubble is because everybody knows that with hundreds of millions of potential users on what is really the new platform, which is mobile, if you hit it right, you will scale and capture Uber-like valuations with incredibly broad reach. Okay, I get it. However, you have to know that for every one of those, there are 10,000 others that don't get anywhere near that and just fall by the wayside. The problem is there's so much money on the sidelines at the moment that wants to think they can pick the next Uber, that if there's any signal that there's somebody who's going to get that kind of opportunity, or whether it's Airbnb or whatever it is they're looking for, they are piling in on it. And that's the lemming mentality that leads to the crazy valuations. And I don't care what anybody says, there is no way that these companies are all going to justify those valuations when time shakes out and they have to justify it in terms of what customers are paying, how that drops through to the bottom line, and how, for example, something like a public market will value it. So that is a bubble.
So old school. This time it's different. Come on.
Listen, I think this time is different. We've got more extremes. We've got a big platform.
This will be my third. This time is different, actually. So
yeah.
I'm kind of used to. No, so it's a really interesting kind of dilemma. I mean, the sort of narrative on creating and founding and growing companies seems to be very kind of skewed by what investors say in the Valley, yeah. And there's some very high-profile angels. This kind of notion that, do you know what, they're playing a portfolio, they're investing in a bunch of companies. If you're Dave McClure, you've got 1,000 investments, albeit not very big. So, you can claim kind of ownership in a lot of different places. And his model, I suppose, relies on 2 of those being unicorns.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Your numbers
his model doesn't care. And I think this is something that people completely forget about the investment community. Is that I'm not having a go at Dave at all. I'm just picking on him because he's a very extreme example of the kind of investor out there. They don't care if individual companies will fail, whereas the entrepreneurs that are committed in those companies, it's the only thing to them, and that balance seems to be sort of out of kilter.
Yeah, I mean, so along with the funding mirage, I have 2 statements that I'd always want entrepreneurs to sort of challenge me on, or come up with their own version of it. One is, the only money that really counts is the customer's money, and until you learn to value that above financing, you've missed the funding mirage, or you're in the funding mirage. The second one is, whatever investors invest, remember, it is nothing compared to the price of you investing your life. Money is money. Your life is time. You can't get it back. So it's an incomparable equation. And so, when you say things, and I think you're dead right. I mean, I think whether it's 500 startups or it's Y Combinator, they are doing good things. I mean, creating programs that help startups is great. But ultimately, it's incumbent upon the startup to say, okay, but am I investing my life in something I really enjoy, that I believe in, that I can persist with, and whether I get funded or not by these guys, I'm going to get customers. And if customers don't buy it, well, that's a different issue. Then you've got to go sort your own, value prop out.
No, I wouldn't pick on either of those 2 organizations either. I think they have done an extraordinary.
Yeah, they've done a great job.
Created huge value.
Yeah.
But there is then that sort of sense of, they get to pick from the most extreme, most driven, most potentially successful entrepreneurs out there, which is great for them. But I think we all need to keep a little bit of perspective on what's important. Okay, look, I think our Q&A thing isn't working, but I've kind of run through most of the questions that we've had from people outside. Anne had a fantastic time chatting to you. Actually, we should more.
We should have fun.
How often are you doing your Harvard talks?
As regularly as well, this time of year it gets quieter. But as you probably know, I've also made sure that they stay open source, so I actually give them everywhere. Yeah. I've got one coming up with Alex Osterwalder. Actually, I should thank you because Alex and I met at BOS, and he's a great guy. We've had some fun chats. We've sat down, had a couple of workshops together, and now we're going to do one in Boston. So.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about that because he's over in September for Business Software USA as well, which I think we're all about for. But no, he was saying he was going to join us on this, but he's in an interview, so I don't know if he's going to be on time or something tomorrow, or whether he'll have a new employee. Who knows? But no, the good things happen at Boston. I think good people come, and we're delighted to have you part of the community, and look forward to catching up. Really appreciate your thoughts on this. We'll put the video up and then come back to you direct if there are any other kind of questions, if that's all.
Be happy to do it. It's a real pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity at BOS. We think it's great.
Brilliant. See you.
Take care.
Bye.